atheists, largely because of their unique and ostensibly significant influence on Western, and to some extent non-Western, intellectual discourse. Having taught at 2 public research universities in the American Midwest, I have found that many of my own colleagues and students have been profoundly impacted by the writings of new atheists. Notwithstanding their numerous detractors, what the new atheists say about jihad and Islam more broadly has had ramifications within academia, to say nothing of the political and cultural spheres. As such, I don't think it makes much sense to ignore them. In the brief time that I have, I'd like to scrutinize the specific new atheist claim that Muslim terrorism can be best explained by the concept of jihad and Islamic scripture. This is the claim I'm going to scrutinize. And of course, this claim is not unique to the new atheists. And I'd like to pay special attention to the ever-influential writings of Sam Harris. Though critical of all monotheistic traditions, Harris has much to say about what he calls the problem with Islam, the title of one of the chapters of his New York Times bestseller, The End of Faith. As Harris presents it, it is Islamic ideology and not, as political scientist Robert Pape maintains, nationalist goals that best explains the phenomenon of Muslim suicide terrorism. After all, he writes, Muslim terrorists define themselves in religious terms. Of course, the same is true for their many opponents, many Muslim opponents, a much larger group. But Harris seems not to be aware of the prevailing interpretations, of the majority interpretations. For example, you see here a passage from The End of Faith, which is published, by the way, in 2004 and then republished in 2005 as a paperback. Harris writes, surely there are Muslim jurists who might say that suicide bombing is contrary to the tenets of Islam. Where are these jurists, by the way? And that suicide bombers are therefore not martyrs, but fresh denizens of hell. Such a minority opinion, if it exists, cannot change the fact that suicide bombings have been rationalized by much of the Muslim world. I want to be clear here. This is not what I'm saying. This is what Sam Harris is saying, and this is what I'm scrutinizing. This is a curious statement. Of course, the reality is that when Harris was writing this, multitudes, not all, of course, but multitudes of prominent Muslim clerics and scholars had publicly and explicitly condemned suicide missions and terrorism more broadly. At one point, Harris remarks, one can only marvel that suicide bombing is not more widespread. This is because his focus is firmly on violent radicals, and therefore Harris neglects the broader Islamic landscape. He was apparently unaware, for instance, that suicide attacks of any kind were historically uncommon in the Sunni tradition claimed by Al-Qaeda. And here I should pause to say that when talking about jihad, Harris's sources are limited, as he relies heavily on the late Bernard Lewis and his discussions of aggressive jihad. Muslim scholarly sources are noticeably absent from Harris's bibliography. Yet even Bernard Lewis, who was hardly an apologist for Islam, had this to say in a 2009 co-authored work. And let me actually move this so you can see this here. So in a 2009 work, Bernard Lewis writes, the emergence of the by now widespread terrorism practice of suicide bombing is a development of the 20th century. It has no antecedents in Islamic history and no justification in terms of Islamic theology, law, or tradition. It is a pity that those who practice this form of terrorism are not better acquainted with their own religion. But again, as Harris would have it, Muslims have not found anything of substance to say against suicide terrorism. That's his claim. And this includes 9/11, September 11 attacks. According to Harris, Muslims have not said anything of substance to condemn the attacks. And of course, this is not true. This is what I intend to show, or what I intend to discuss. The reality is that the targeting of innocents was a recurring theme in the September 2001 condemnations issued by countless scholars and clerics, including, by the way, clerics who were known to have anti-American views, like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, for example. Even these scholars were condemning the September 11 attacks. Be that as it may, as Harris sees it, what makes Muslim extremists extreme is their devotion to the literal word of the Quran and the Hadith. That's one of the big claims that Harris makes. Violent radicals, we are led to believe, are monsters precisely because of their close adherence to the letter of Scripture. This is a point Harris makes in various writings, including The End of Faith and his 2015 co-authored book, Islam and the Future of Tolerance, with Majid Nawaz, who does identify as Muslim. Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Richard Dawkins make similar claims in their respective works. In her 2015 book, Heretic, Ali argues that Islamic violence is rooted in the foundational texts of Islam itself. Dawkins offers a comparable claim in his 2006 New York Times bestseller, The God Delusion. But in blaming Islam's foundational texts for contemporary terrorism, while downplaying other factors, Harris, Ali, and Dawkins present explanations that are just as simplistic as those of the apologists they criticize. And the apologists here are those who say, this has nothing to do with religion. So what the new atheists say is clearly, no, religion is being quoted, it's cited, people are saying this is Islamic. So they dismiss the apologists, but their own explanations that it's primarily religion, like the literal reading of Scripture, that this is the problem, this is also simplistic. So, and to illustrate this point, this idea that its literalism is the problem, that this claim that the new atheists is making, to show how problematic it is, I want to show you two examples of writings, of statements and writings by violent radical groups. And we begin with ISIS, or Daesh, or ISIL, or whichever term you like. Now, there's a lot to say about ISIS or Daesh, but in the interest of time, I'd like to focus on a single article that appeared in the January 2017 issue of the online ISIS magazine, Rumiyya. The article, entitled Collateral Carnage, presents a justification for terrorism against its enemies, and it justifies the killing of innocent civilians. According to this anonymous article, although Muslims may not exclusively target non-threatening, non-Muslim women and children who are neither under Muslim rule nor protected by a truce, such innocents may be generally attacked nonetheless if they are not distinctly isolated or easily distinguishable from enemy non-Muslim men. This is now how it's being presented in ISIS literature, Daesh literature. And according to this particular article, all non-Muslim men not under Muslim rule and not protected by a truce, all such non-Muslim men would be considered combatants, according to this Daesh or ISIS article. This, by the way, contradicts the May 2017 issue of the same magazine, Rumiyah, which notes that some categories of men are not to be treated as combatants, like those who are elderly and so on. So we actually have a contradiction within just a few months in the same ISIS magazine. And this just goes to show how sloppy these writings can be. In any case, to justify the collateral killing of innocent women and children, the Rumiyah, the ISIS or Daesh author, points to two reported prophetic precedents. In other words, to justify this claim that the author is making, the author is going to point to two things, two Islamic sources as evidence. Okay? One is the idea that the Prophet, peace be upon him, permitted the use of mangonels or catapults. So you imagine when you read this ISIS or Daesh article, you imagine the Prophet using a catapult and launching things, maybe something that's on fire, launching it over a wall and into a city where there could be men, women, and children. That's the way one reads it when you read the ISIS magazine. And the ISIS author, the Daesh author, claims that this was common even during the life of the Prophet, this way of fighting. The author's assumption is that the Prophet used a weapon of mass destruction that led to the deaths of innocents. But what is this based on? In fact, if we go back and look at the sources, if we go back and look at, first of all, you're not going to find much in the hadith tradition about this, but if you look at the seerah works, what's interesting is, some seerah, some of the biographies of the Prophet, don't even mention this at all. And then there is one, there is a couple of biographies that mention that the Prophet did use or attempted to use mangonels or al-manjaniq against Banu Thaqif in Ta'if. But what's interesting is when you look at the only detailed account that we have, the only detailed account we have paints a picture that's very different from that used by the ISIS author. In the rare detailed account we have, we read that the Prophet's Persian companion, Salman al-Farisi, suggested the use of a mangonel to breach the walls of the fortress of the enemy. And this is here the Thaqif, the Banu Thaqif. Accordingly, the Muslims constructed a mangonel, but they never actually put it to use, as the individuals who were attempting to operate it were killed. So the Muslims who were trying to prepare this were actually killed when the forces of Banu Thaqif attacked them with hot iron and arrows. The Muslim army gave up on the mangonel and just continued until the battle ended. Thus, according to this account, the Prophet only tried to use a mangonel once in a brief, unsuccessful attempt, and this is the key point, to breach walls that were guarded by combatants. In other words, this is not the Prophet saying, okay, let's launch catapults, let's launch objects over the wall into the city. No, this is to launch objects at a wall guarded by soldiers. And even then, once they weren't even able to use it. And it was not something on fire, it would have been just a heavy stone, not something that would then spread with fire. So this is very different from how it's presented in the ISIS article. The ISIS article, the Daesh article, does not give the reader this indication at all. It makes it seem, again, as if there are maybe things that are on fire that are being launched over the wall into the city. There is no basis for this in the one detailed account that we have. And the Rumiyya author, the ISIS author, the Daesh author, does not seem to be aware of these detailed accounts. And the author even controversially compares mangonels to most missiles and explosives of today, even though many Muslim scholars historically distinguished between attacking fortifications with mangonels and using fire. They saw those as two different things in many of the works of fiqh, of Islamic jurisprudence. The second thing that is used to justify the killing of innocents is a hadith. And it's a hadith that appears in the collection of Al-Bukhari and Muslim. And in this hadith, the Prophet is asked whether it would be permissible to attack an enemy force at night when it's dark. And he responds in the affirmative, indicating that if any non-combatant is harmed unintentionally, well, they are of the combatants. It was unintentional, but they are there, and this is the only way to fight. This is the only time to fight. We can call this the "they are of them" hadith. And I'll say more about this hadith in a moment. But with this in mind, the Rumiyya author goes on to say that not only is it permissible to attack at night, it is best to attack at night. The ISIS, the Daesh author claims the best practice when conducting raids is to start during the night or at the break of dawn before the sun rises, while the enemy is asleep and no light shines and an adult male is not easily distinguishable from women and children. And this is pretty shocking. So basically encouraging attacks when you don't know who's who. The author attempts to support this claim that it is best to attack in the dark while the enemy is sleeping by pointing to the example of God. And the author points to a verse in the Quran that says that God destroyed towns at night or while people were sleeping in the afternoon. This represents a remarkable conflation of the human with the divine. As for the normative example of the Prophet, the ISIS author, the Daesh author, makes no reference to and demonstrates no awareness of the well-known hadith recorded by Al-Bukhari that states that whenever the Prophet reached a people by night, he never started an attack until it was morning. So there's actually a hadith, not the one you see here, I'll get to this hadith in a moment, but there's actually a hadith in Al-Bukhari's collection that says whenever the Prophet reached a group at night, he waited until the morning, and actually because of this, some people have claimed that the other hadith that I mentioned, that they are of them hadith, that this may have been abrogated. But in any case, the Prophet's example was he never started an attack at night. And this is in Al-Bukhari's collection. So imagine the ISIS author saying it's best to attack at night, and you have a hadith in Al-Bukhari's collection saying the exact opposite. And in fact, there are various hadiths that tell us that the Prophet, for instance, when he reached Khaybar, he reached the city of Khaybar at night, but he waited until the morning when people were awake, and this is when the conflict began. In any case, the non-combatant killings that the ISIS or Daesh author attempts to justify are far more intentional than what is suggested in the "they are of them" hadith, as commonly understood. As the author, the Daesh author, the ISIS author, calls for the targeting of non-Muslims using highly destructive technology and weaponry, including, again, the missiles and explosives of today. As such, the ISIS author can hardly be described as a literalist. They cannot be described as literalists, especially when you consider this hadith, the hadith that the Prophet forbade the killing of women and children, which is considered one of the most widely accepted hadiths we have, and it appears in numerous hadith collections. And this is besides the fact that there are other hadiths about all kinds of other categories of people who are not to be harmed, including people who are men who are on the battlefield with the enemy, paid to do services, but they're not fighting. So there are all kinds of hadiths about categories of people who are not to be harmed. But certainly the hadith about women and children, this is widely accepted. And so again, it's hard to say that they are literalists when they are saying it's okay to kill women and children. You just can't, you don't target them, but clearly you're targeting them. As for bin Laden, this is the second case study, the second example I'd like to focus on here. You may recall I began the presentation with Sam Harris saying bin Laden is honest and he's going by what the Quran says. As for bin Laden, recall that Harris portrayed him as a model Muslim and one whose interpretation is honest and straightforward. But consider some of the interpretive acrobatics bin Laden performed in his generally unsuccessful attempt to convince Muslim clerics and others, including many who had anti-American views already, that the September 11 attacks could be justified. So first, Osama bin Laden says that the tactics that were used on 9/11 were necessary because of U.S. aggression and they served the common good. But for many, this idea of invoking the common good is problematic when it doesn't seem to be serving the common good. And although the September 11 attacks were directed mostly at civilians, many busy at work, he asserted that these attacks were not targeting innocents, but rather the symbol of a threatening enemy, and that collateral casualties were therefore acceptable. But this was widely regarded as disingenuous. It's not as if he attacked, the Statue of Liberty when people were not there. No, he was attacking, the attacks, I should say, were during, a Tuesday morning where people were busy at work. And for good measure, he made the modern argument that American adult civilians could be treated as combatants because they pay taxes, but this is required by law, and that they vote, but people don't vote unanimously, and they're not responsible necessarily for the views of their government officials. And in fact, all one has to do is to look at the Battle of Uhud to see an example of innocent civilians who are going, and you actually have a group of women cheering on the group that's fighting the Muslims, and they were not to be harmed, even though they're clearly supporting the army. So even if people were to vote, if that's considered an issue, that would not render them combatants by that logic. In any case, what I'd like to focus on is a October 2001 interview with Al Jazeera reporter Taysir Allouni. In this interview, bin Laden declared, "The scholars and people of knowledge, among them Sahib al-Ikhtiyarat, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn al-Qayyim and al-Shawkani, and many others, and al-Qurtubi, may God bless him, in his Quran commentary, say that if the disbelievers were to kill our children and women, then we should not feel ashamed to do the same to them, mainly to deter them from trying to kill our children and women again." Now, notice that here bin Laden invokes these four scholars to justify his idea that you can kill, that Muslims can target innocent civilians. The reality, however, is that none of these four scholars actually said this. In fact, if you go down the line, Ibn Taymiyyah is very clear that you can only fight those who are actually fighting. And what's interesting is that notice how in this interview, bin Laden praises al-Qurtubi. What's interesting is al-Qurtubi actually says the exact opposite of what bin Laden claims he said. Al-Qurtubi in his tafsir, in his commentary on the Quran, and specifically his commentary on Surah 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 8. This is what Al-Qurtubi says. He says, even if enemy forces killed our women and children and made us grieve on account of this, then it is still not permissible for us to kill them intentionally in a similar manner to cause them to grieve and be sad. Notice this is the exact opposite of what bin Laden said. Bin Laden said the exact opposite. Now, there's a lot more that one could say about bin Laden's various ostensibly contradictory justifications for the attacks, but suffice it to say, the point I'm trying to make is this. He was by no means a literalist, somebody who's going by what the texts say. And again, we can go back to this hadith about not targeting women and children as a simple example. And what we find is that actually violent radical groups, they tend to justify terrorism on Islamic grounds, but they do this by abandoning literalism and the prevailing, the majority interpretations. And that's, I think, maybe the key point here, is that, yeah, they are quoting the Quran. Yes, they are. They are claiming Islam, yes, but they are doing it in ways that are unusual. They're not going by the letter of the law. They're not taking things literally to justify these violent acts. And actually, they're going against the majority interpretation. So these are sort of their own thing. There's no, from a historical perspective, it's difficult to find a precedent for this. Now, as I said, the new atheists say that the violent radicals, they're simply going by what's in the Quran and by what Muslim scholars have said. But actually, what we find is that the reality is more complicated than that. Here, for example, I'd like to highlight the writing, a statement by Jessica Stern in an article that appeared in Foreign Affairs in 2010. The article is called Mind Over Martyr. In this article, Jessica Stern says that terrorism spreads in part through bad ideas. The most dangerous and seductive bad idea spreading around the globe today is a distorted and destructive interpretation of Islam, which asserts that killing innocents is a way to worship God. Part of the solution must come from within Islam and from Islamic scholars who can refute this ideology with arguments based on theology and ethics. But bad ideas are only
Professor
part of the
Khalil,
problem. Yes.
You have 3 minutes to
Oh,
wrap
okay,
up
thank
your
you.
presentation.
Yep, thank you. But bad ideas are only part of the problem. Terrorists prey on vulnerable populations, people who feel humiliated or victimized or who find their identities by joining extremist movements. So here we see a statement that makes a lot more sense than what the new atheists are saying. It's giving context, it's showing that there are multiple factors at play. Now, I'll close with this. Less than a month before the aforementioned interview, the interview I began with Fareed Zakaria and Harris. Harris, he appears here on the right. He had appeared on Real Time with Bill Maher, a famous TV show here in America, in the midst of a heated exchange with actor Ben Affleck on the subject of Islam. Harris, having stated that he was actually well educated on the topic, proclaimed, "We have to be able to criticize bad ideas, and Islam is the motherlode of bad ideas." That's Harris's statement. He proceeded to claim that suicide bombers occupy the center of Muslim communities. We are misled to think that the fundamentalists are the fringe. But what I would like to argue is that the Islam that Harris portrays in his writings, the Islam that he portrays does appear to be a motherlode of bad ideas, but it's not the Islam of the vast majority of Muslims, whether scholars or lay people. And they would not recognize what Harris is describing. And I didn't really get a chance to get into it in this presentation, but there are numerous examples of Harris misrepresenting Islam. in his writings. And so I would actually call that a mother lode of bad analysis. It's even more extreme in some ways than bin Laden's Islam. So the Islam that Harris presents is actually more extreme than the Islam that is presented by bin Laden. And this is because Harris draws a nearly straight line from the Islamic tradition to 9/11. As if, if you read the Quran, 9/11 is the logical conclusion. Whereas if you look at bin Laden's writings and his statements, he says, well, even if we were not Muslim, we would want to attack America. That's what he says, because of what America did, and with Israel and Iraq and Saudi Arabia. So this is how bin Laden spends a lot of time talking about geopolitics. But for Harris, bin Laden's grievances are purely theological, and that's of course not true. What I would say is that Harris's interpretation of Islam is so extreme that it cannot even be ascribed to bin Laden. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation, Prof. Halil. Now, dear attendees, we come to the Q&A session. This is how it is going to go. I will read the questions and then Prof. Halil is going to address it directly. So the first question is actually coming from Brother Dion. Okay, the question is, Muslim define jihad?
Yeah, very good question. First of all, I will say that there are many people who misrepresent jihad on both sides, if you will. In other words, there are people who will say jihad is, holy war against non-Muslims. That's one way it's presented. Then you have other people who say, oh, jihad has nothing to do with fighting. Of course, the reality is that jihad is a lot of things. And this is something I point out in my courses. I'll say that, look, jihad literally means a struggle. It can include armed struggle. Yes, it's possible. The question, though, is what are the limits of armed struggle? What do we mean by armed struggle? And this is, I think, the critical question. But of course, jihad could include a lot of other things. Jihad in nafs, the jihad with yourself. The Quran, there's a famous hadith that says the best jihad is a true word in the face of a tyrant. So to speak the truth to a tyrant ruler. So there are a lot of kinds of jihad, and of course, it would be a mistake to assume that it's only violent. No, there are. In many spiritual books, the word jihad is used actually because of that jihad in nafs, the jihad of the self. So we have to look at all the different aspects of jihad.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Halil. The next question is coming from Esha Atika, and the question is, how do American people react if the local American people ask about the wrong interpretation of jihad?
Yeah. So I will say that there are many wrong interpretations of jihad in America, in the American context. Yes, I see it all the time. I see the extremely violent interpretations where actually they would say that terrorism is jihad. They would say something like this. And then you see the other people who are apologists who will say it has nothing to do with fighting. And again, we have to be very careful. How do American people react? Well, it depends on how educated they are. And the reality is that there is a range among Americans. There's a wide variety. There are Americans who are well educated. They know what jihad is. They understand it well. But probably they're a small minority. For the majority, there are misconceptions, and they will remain misconceptions, unfortunately, unless somebody goes out there and corrects it.
Okay. Okay, now we come to the third question. We do agree that there are we do agree that there are some misinterpretation with the term of jihad or war, either stated in the Quran or in the Sunnah. The issue of jihad or extremism is also triggered by political maneuvers or movement made by the parties in the globe. In other words, I think it is because of injustice of the word as acted by a developed and rich country. Some, in my opinion, there should be a simultaneous effort made by both sides, Muslim people on the one hand and the West on the other. I guess it is something like a comment coming from Bapak Asep Saipuddin Jahar. And would you have some response on that, Prof. Halil?
Yeah, no, I think this is a great point. I think this is a great point. We have to recognize that there are injustices and that there are grievances, real grievances, and we have to recognize those grievances. So just because we're saying that terrorism, violent extremism is not justified in Islam, that's not to say that people shouldn't have grievances. They shouldn't have complaints. And there are good reasons to complain and to have grievances against my own country, the United States. So I think we have to be honest. We have to talk about these things, and we have to recognize that there are problems, and we have to acknowledge them. I agree with this absolutely.
Okay. We are still waiting for questions. We are still waiting for questions from you attendees. But then while waiting, I'm actually have my own question. So listening to your presentation, Professor Halil, I am more interested in the so-called new atheist movement. New atheist movement. I do. I am 100%. I 100% agree that you are in Muslim studies. So that's why then the concentration of the study is definitely something to do with Muslim. But we cannot deny that the so-called new atheist movement is not only targeting on one specific, or is it
No, sir.
targeting on one specific of some some others would include what's up.
Yes, I think that it broke up a little bit, but I think I heard the question, and I would say no. Certainly, they do criticize other religions. Absolutely.
Could you hear?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, no, they certainly do criticize other religions. I know that Sam Harris, for instance, after writing The End of Faith, he wrote a short book, Letter to a Christian Nation, where he is very critical of Christianity. But I would say that, at least in the case of Harris and Ayan Hirsi Ali, they do tend to focus, they do tend to kind of reserve maybe more of their vitriol for Islam, more of their criticisms for Islam. Now, others maybe not. Richard Dawkins, it's hard to say. I mean, he does say some pretty strong statements against Islam, but maybe he does say a bit more about Christianity. So yeah, it does vary, I think, from one new atheist to the other.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we have another question coming needed for you. Is an image is identical Lil Alamin, and then would you tell that the Indonesian bomber are also becoming our crucial problem faced by our nation? Is something like a comment, and would you say any comment about this statement, Prof. Halil?
Yeah, I would say that certainly, you know, I've actually never been to Indonesia, but certainly the impression that we have here in the United States is generally a very positive impression of Islam in Indonesia. That's at least for the many people that I speak to, there is a very positive impression. Not to say that it's perfect, of course. You're always going to have a report here or there, but certainly it's far more positive than the impression people might have of my family's country, which is Egypt. I think there's definitely a very positive reputation that Indonesia has. So I think that, and people are beginning to understand this. And one thing I always tell my students the first day of class, I always ask them, what is the country with the largest Muslim population? And, sometimes they have no idea. And many times they're surprised. Indonesia? It's not Saudi Arabia. It's not Egypt. It's not, Pakistan. No, it's actually Indonesia. And I think this opens many people's eyes. And they begin to ask questions. Well, what is Islam like in Indonesia? So yeah, I think this is a very interesting point.
Okay. So that's the last question coming from Bapak Sunardi from UIN Sultan Jambi. Okay, I guess that's all, dear attendees and ladies and gentlemen. I think we need to bring this to the end. And then this is the end of our presentation. So thank you once again to Professor Muhammad Hassan Khalil from Michigan State University in the USA. And for all the conference attendees, thank you very much for your participation, your interest, your enthusiasm, and attention. It has been a great pleasure to have all of you here, and have an inspired day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, probably. So are you going to say something to Prof. Halil, because it looks like that he's waiting. You can anything.
I have a problem with connection. But the video is frozen.
Still I can hear you.
Sekarang siapa, Pak?
Sekarang gambar Bapak.
Sekarang nggak ada yang berbicara.
Udah selesai. Di close kayaknya.
Thank you, Bro.
Thank you. Okay, I'll see you. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And see you inshallah in November.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Hamislimi.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Professor Dr. Hamid Slim is an educator, spiritual leader, a teacher, and a community developer. He is the current chairman and professor at the Canadian Center for Deen Studies. He is also the resident scholar, imam, and founder of Sheida Khadija Center in Mississauga, Ontario, and the founder and president of Faith of Life Network. Dr. Slim's traditional and academic specialty is in Islamic studies and jurisprudence, as well as comparative world religions and anthropology. Dr. Slimi holds 2 master's degrees with high honors in both disciplines from Morocco and the US, and a PhD in Islamic law from the UK from 2009 till 2019. Dr. Slimi has been featured by Georgetown University as one of the 500 most influential Muslims in the world for his community development efforts as well as his spiritual, leadership, and interfaith work. He has been representing the Muslim community at many multified councils and in the continuous interfaith dialogue. Among his many works are his latest book, Our Prophet, a concise biography, both in Arabic and English. He will soon, inshallah, publish his latest book, The Concept of Life in Islam. To this date, Dr. Slimi has hosted and produced over 400 TV shows and short talks, as well as over 750 videos, and hundreds of CDs on different subjects related to faith and life matters.
ماهية ونوعية العلاقة بين الإنسان والإنسان، وبين الإنسان وخالقه، وبين الإنسان والمخلوقات. وهذا الدين نسميه دراسة الدينية أو الدراسات الإسلامية، نسميه الدراسات الإسلامية حيث ندرسه من جوانب عدة: عقيدة وشريعة وتاريخا وأدبا وغير ذلك. فهذا الدين الإسلامي يدرس من خلال الدراسات الإسلامية. فإذا كانت العربية هي لغة اللسان، فإن الدين هو لغة القلب والوجدان. فاللغة أساس كل شيء، حيث هي التي تضمن التواصل، وهي التي تظهر الحضارة بشكل يبين علاقة الإنسان بربه وعلاقة الإنسان بالإنسان، وهذا التواصل أساسي. والآن نحن في هذه الندوة من غير اللغة لا يمكن لنا أن نتواصل. فالحمد لله اللغة مهمة جدا، ولذلك الدراسات الإسلامية هي كذلك لغة العقل. فالذي يدرس الهندسة أو الطب أو الصيدلة أو أي علوم، إذا كان عنده مخزون علمي وديني ينظر إلى العالم بنظرة غير نظرة العلمانية أي التي تفرق الدين وكل ما له علاقة بالدين بالعلوم، وتنكر للدين دوره في بناء المجتمع أو في بناء الحضارة. على عكس ذلك، كما يقول العلامة ابن خلدون وغيره من علماء المسلمين، أن للدين دور. والشاهد على ذلك والدليل أن النبي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم بنى حضارة إسلامية عظيمة، انتشرت إلى بقاع الأرض، من الفلبين إلى المغرب، ومن روسيا إلى جنوب أفريقيا لقرون عدة. فالإسلام دين حضارة، ولو لم يكن للإسلام دور في تاريخ البشرية لما وصلنا إلى ما وصلنا إليه اليوم من تقدم وحضارة، ولا ما وصل الإنسان إلى القمر وإلى كواكب مثل مارس وغيرها. فلذلك للدين دور إذا أخذ بمبادئه ونظرته العالمية، كما يرشدنا القرآن: أفلا يتدبرون. ذلك التدبر يعني البحث في أمور الدنيا، والبحث في أمور الكون، والاكتشاف والاختراع والعلوم. لذلك نجد كثيرا من علماء المسلمين بدأوا بالدراسات الدينية الإسلامية، ثم انطلقوا من مبدأ القرآن وعلوم الدين إلى علوم الدنيا. الإمام الغزالي رحمه الله في كتابه المشهور إحياء علوم الدين قسم الكتاب، وفي ذكره للعلوم قسمها إلى علوم الآخرة وعلوم الدنيا. فحينما ذكر علوم الدنيا قال إذا سخرت، أو ليس بمعنى ما قال، إذا سخرت هذه العلوم في خدمة الناس وخدمة الناس من الدين، وفي الاكتشاف وخدمة الخلق، فهي كعلوم الآخرة في الأجر والثواب. فعلوم الدنيا إذا استخدمت بنية الإصلاح ومحاربة الفساد فهي من الدين. فالإسلام يقسم العمل بين إصلاح وإفساد حتى لا ينتج عن ذلك فساد أو صلاح. يجب للمصلح الذي يعمل سواء بعلوم الدين أو بعلوم الدنيا. لذلك الدراسات الإسلامية لها دور على مستوى الشخصي، وهو المستوى الإنسان الذي يدرس مثلا علوم الدنيا كالطب والهندسة وغير ذلك. هذا الإنسان الذي عنده وازع ديني وعنده معرفة بعلوم الدين. فمثلا الطبيب يعلم بمبادئ الطب من المنظور الإسلامي، الذي يتعامل بالأموال والذي يتعامل بالتجارة يعلم أحكام الإسلام في أمور عدة متعلقة بالمعاملات المالية. في البيوع وغير ذلك. فالإسلام دين كامل شامل يتطرق إلى أمور الدنيا كما يتطرق إلى أمور الآخرة، بل أكثر من ذلك. في القرآن الكريم الكلام عن الطلاق والزواج والبيوع أكثر من الكلام عن الصلاة. ولذلك عندنا أكبر آية في القرآن آية 282 هي آية عن المكاتبة المداينة، يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تداينتم بدين. أكبر وأطول آية في مصحف المدينة، يعني تأخذ صفحة كاملة 15 يعني سطر. هذه الآية هي ليست في أمور في أمور الدين، ولكن في أمور الدنيا. Okay. 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 Thank you. Sorry. أمور الدنيا هي في الحقيقة ليست مقتصرة على علوم محدودة، وإنما هي تتعلق بالدين والدنيا. على المستوى الأكاديمي نجد أن علماء الإسلام حينما انطلقوا من مبدأ الاكتشاف والاختراع والبحث في الأرض لخدمة الناس وللإصلاح وإزالة الفساد، برعوا في علوم الدنيا. إن شاء الله هذه فقط مقدمة باللغة العربية. I move to the English part of my speech to emphasize that the Arabic language, if it's the language of the Quran, the religion Islam is the language of the intellect and the language of the heart, because we're discussing here today the role that the Islamic studies can play in other studies and how it's critical. However, from a secular point of view, it might sound the antithesis of secularism, because in secular terms, religion has nothing to do with science. However, we know very well that Islam as a civilization played a major role in changing the course of humanity. Had it not been for the Islamic studies and the knowledge of the religion, we would not actually have achieved many things in science. It is the scholars of Islam that started with the exploration of the Islamic principles of creation, of walking on earth and discovering. They were the ones who actually excelled in science, in medicine, in engineering, and many walks of life. Ibn Khaldun, a great scholar, we call him the father of sociology, in his book, The Introduction Al-Muqaddimah, demonstrated the critical role of religion in shaping the civilization, which he referred to in the word Al-Umran, which would be translated as civilization, building society. Ibn Khaldun spoke of the critical role of religion and how religion was enough to change a society like the Arab society, which was not a civilization. Because of religion, Prophet Muhammad started the foundation of civilization. Modern Western scholars who are fair and objective, when they study Islam, speak about Islam, they actually speak of Islam as a civilization, not only a religion. So when we speak about the impact or role of Islamic studies on other studies, there are two, of course, impacts at the level of the personal level of the person, and also at the academic level. And if we go a little bit into the academic level, as we know in science, scientific research, even in literary, academic work, You start with a theory based on an observation, and then you demonstrate through experience and through, of course, if it's science, through labs, you put it into, experiments, and then you come to a conclusion. That is actually a scientific way of, deducing a certain ruling or a theory, proving a theory. In Islam, it was the people who started, actually, who made mathematics. They took, for instance, the zero from India. And the Muslims, the very first Muslim in 2nd and 3rd century of the Islamic civilization, and brought other concepts from other civilizations and put them all together, and it came up with theories that change, actually, the course of history. We wouldn't have binaries and computers, and today we're talking about quantum computers and a different thing, without those very principles that were put 1400 years ago by Muslim scholars. We're not claiming that everything came from the Muslims, but we're claiming that the beginning and the strong foundation of the scientific research started with the Islamic science. And it was because of Islamic studies. We refer in modern language today to it as Islamic studies, but it is the deen, it is the religion. And that's how it impacted the research. Also, Ibn Sina, in his book, about medicine, he actually laid the foundation based on the knowledge of revelation. Yes, you do the research, but it is Islam, it is that understanding of the creator and the creation, and the surface of relationship we have with the creation, the relationship that we have with the creator and the personal level, that actually makes the researcher or the scientist or whoever you want to call the academic person look with a different perception. In the secular terms, in the secular view, religion has nothing to do with the research or science, whereas we say that Islam actually gives us an idea that here we are, everything was created, that revelation told us about the world. Yes, we do have the free will and free choice to change things. However, our free will and free choice is limited because there is a divine will. That very view is not available, or it's not actually the case with the secular view of life. Another role that Islamic studies play in the research or science is that it's extremely important to have some Islamic background. And that's why I like Owen. Owen as an example, in my experience there, you have what we call the interdisciplinary studies. And interdisciplinary studies is you specialize in, let's say, in economics, or you specialize in medicine, but you do have a background in Islamic studies. So when you study, for instance, economics, you study economics from a different perspective compared to other universities. So you study economics as anybody who studies economics, but also you have the role of Islam in economics, the Islamic principles of economics. I'll give you an example. Some of the people who work now in the financial world, they do go and study with us at the Canadian Center for these Studies. We offer an interdisciplinary course on Islamic finance, and it's usually attended by people who are experts in finance, experts in economics, and they want to know how is the Islamic financing, built, and so they can actually custom make a product for their Muslim customers who don't believe in usury, in riba, or they have Islamic principles. So now in Canada, in America, there are Sharia compliant products in different financial institutions. Even in the stock market, there is the Islamic index in Dow Jones. There are many things that actually relate to Islamic principles, and to your surprise or to some of your attendees' surprise, is that some of the non-Muslims like the idea of Islamic financing because it's fair, it's not based on deceit, doubt, and even the products related to insurance, for instance, they are actually very impressed with the concept of looking for benefit for not only the financial institution and for the poor people and those who cannot afford. And because the Islamic concept of riba, for instance, as you very well know, is refused in Islam and rejected, and says, as Allah says, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, trade and business and exchanging goods is the alternative and the best way. And not only the alternative is actually I would say in Arabic, the asl is the default. And then the riba is the selfish way of making money while empowering, many nations. This is the reality of many nations today. But that's just an example to show you the thing. In medicine, for instance, what we call ethical medicine, it might not be called Islamic medicine, but it comes in line with the Islamic principles. Can we practice ethical medicine instead of medicine that is only profit-driven, just making money? These are values that the Islamic studies or religion could bring in to the academic level and change, of course, many interdisciplinary studies. Owen, for instance, has program in economics, has program in science, has different programs. But then the Islamic studies are present there to show the Islamic view vis-a-vis many fields for research. So I would leave the rest for discussion and questions and answers rather than me talking. But this basically just a drop or just some points that relate to the topic that was assigned to me.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Hamid Slimi, for your excellent presentations. And we have here some questions from the audience in the chat, and let me read it. First is from Muhammad Yusuf in Arabic. هل اللغات غير العربية تضمن توصيل الفحوى التي تريد إرسالها الدراسات الإسلامية بصورة مقنعة أم ليست لها بديل في هذا المجال؟ ربما أنا أقرأ سؤالا بعد سؤال، سؤالا واحدا وتجيب ثم سنخطو إلى سؤال آخر. تفضل يا أستاذ.
لا، في الحقيقة اللغة هي وسيلة، ولكنها وسيلة أساسية. ليس يعني قصدي الاقتصار فقط على اللغة العربية. إذا كانت لغة بهزة مثلا الإندونيسية هي لغة تطورت عبر الزمن وتأثرت باللغة العربية وبالحضارة الإسلامية وحضارات أخرى، لكن إذا كانت المفاهيم والمبادئ نفسها فلا بأس، ممكن تبليغ الإسلام ودراسة الدراسات الإسلامية باللغة الإندونيسية أو اللغة الإنجليزية ما دامت المبادئ هي نفسها، لأنه مفهوم مثلا العدل justice هو مفهوم عالمي، مفهوم يعني يفهمه الجميع. لكن إذا عزز ذلك المفهوم بمفاهيم قرآنية وترجمت بأمانة وبطريقة صحيحة فلا بأس. المقصد من ذكر اللغة هو فقط قياسا على اللغة. قلت إذا كانت اللغة العربية أو الإندونيسية لغة اللسان فالدين هو لغة العقل والوجدان. هذا الكلام يعني أن ننظر إلى الأشياء بلغة مختلفة بمنظور ديني هو ما يسمى بإكسبريشن، تعبير. فإذا فهم التعبير فسواء كانت إسبانية أو إندونيسية أو فرنسية، ما دام المفهوم وصل والمبادئ وصلت فهذا يعني يكفي إن شاء الله.
أيوة. شكرا كثيرا. The second question comes from Pak Sunardi in English. Science and technology, as you said a moment ago, started from Islamic scholars such as Ibn Sina and Ibn Khaldun. But how come science and technology today is dominated by non-Muslim countries, especially by the Western countries?
It's a question that usually people ask, why is science today is absent from the Islamic world, and for us to become scientists, we have to go study in Europe, in America. Why? What did we lose? Well, we lost civilization. When we were civilized, when we focused on establishing justice, when we focused on service, when we focused on unity, when we focused on serving everybody, not serving ourselves, we were able to bring ourselves to a high level of civilization where science was honored, people of knowledge were honored. When we started fighting a lost power and colonized a lost, today in the Muslim world, many people do not value science or Islamic, whether Islamic sciences or, scientific research. They don't value education. When we devalue those principles, of course, we are going to lose. So at one time in Andalus and other places, Europe came to study, to learn mathematics, to learn physics, to learn medicine. And they took it and developed it and found that this is the only course, this is the only way to change their lives. And they actually, in their view, religion was an impediment, was a problem, because their religion was actually discouraging exploration. I referred to earlier research, discovering the world, discussing the universe, discussing, the planet and the movement of the planet and all of this. As we know in Galileo's example, Copernicus and others, that they were rejected by the church and others. The religion was against it. And then they separated, they made a secular view and they developed science. Of course, if you walk, you will change your station. Normal. If you make a movement, you will change your place. But if you're stagnant and stay where you are, you can't move. And this is the situation with the Muslim world today. Having said that, alhamdulillah, we should not be pessimistic. Inshallah, things will change today. Just to give you an example, in America, North America, 75% of the Muslims have at least bachelor degree, at least, and many, more than 35% have masters, and there is a large number of PhDs and medical doctors. Maybe these people, they will, of course, contribute to the Muslim world. Today, the Muslim world is not restricted to Muslim countries. Muslim world includes the 35 to 40% Muslim minorities. So, inshallah, so long as we are optimistic and there is more conferences like this and universities promoting a balanced view between religion and science and moderate view, inshallah, if we don't achieve it now, our children or our grandchildren will achieve it. We just need to teach those who are studying religion the importance of science and scientific research and technology. And we have to teach those who are studying science and technology the importance of religion. Once we strike that balance, things will become clearer to everyone.
Yeah, we agree with that positive thinking, Professor Amit Salimi. هناك سؤالان متساويان الأول من إدي كورنياوان Pak Edi Kurniawan من كلية الشريعة في UIN Jambi وثانيا من بحر المعاني والسؤال كما تقول أن العلوم عند الإمام الغزالي ينقسم إلى قسمين الأول علوم الدين والثاني علوم الدنيا أهذا بمعنى أنه علمانية أم يريد الإمام قسما من أقسام العلوم لذلك كل علوم الدنيا تنفع للآخرة أم تفسير آخر وكذلك بحر المعاني يسأل عن انقسام العلوم عند الإمام الغزالي ما المراد من هذا الانقسام ما المراد من هذا الانقسام تفضل أستاذ.
نعم، في كتاب إحياء علوم الدين قسم الإمام الغزالي العلوم إلى علوم الدنيا وعلوم الآخرة في كتاب ذم الدنيا. فالمقصود من هذا أنه قسم العلم، يعني تفرغ الإنسان للتعلم، إما يتعلم أمور الدنيا أي الطب والفلسفة والهندسة وغير ذلك التي لها علاقة بأمور الدنيا، بخدمة الناس، التطبيب مثلا، البناء، الإعمار، التجهيز، كل هذه الأشياء تسمى علوم الدنيا. أما علوم الآخرة أي العلوم التي يعنى بها الدراسات الإسلامية، عقيدة والشريعة والفقه والتصوف وغير ذلك من العلوم التي يحتاجها طالب علم الدين في علومه. فهو هذا التقسيم يبين الإمام الغزالي دور علوم الدين في علوم الدين أو علوم الآخرة كما يقول، لأنها تنفع الإنسان في الآخرة، لأنها مبنية على الوحي. أما علوم الدنيا هي مبنية على التجربة. إذن بخلاصة شديدة، لأنه الكتاب طويل والكتاب إحياء علوم الدين معروف وموجود حتى على الإنترنت، لكن يجب فهم أن الإسلام يفرق بما يسمى بين العلوم أو revealed knowledge، العلوم التي أساسها الوحي، نقول القرآن والسنة. حينما نتحدث القرآن كلام الله، السنة أو السنة بما فيها السنة التقريرية والعملية وغيرها هي من فعل وقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم الذي لا ينطق عن الهوى إن هو إلا وحي يوحى. فهذا التراث أو هذه الخزينة أو هذه العلوم كلها التي كتبها وألفها علماء الإسلام مرجعها إلى القرآن والسنة، فهي تسمى أساسها الوحي. أما علوم الطب والهندسة وغير ذلك والفلسفة وغير ذلك إنما هي أساسها التجربة وأساسها التفكر والتدبر، لكن يجمع بينها في كما ذكر الإمام الغزالي في ما يسمى بالخدمة، العلوم التي تكون للدنيا، لكن يقصد بها خدمة الخلق، خدمة الخلق، خدمة الناس، خدمة الناس، وكذلك الإصلاح. في عندنا مفهوم الإصلاح والإفساد، الصلاح والفساد، ليصلحوا في الأرض، ليفسدوا في الأرض. الله عز وجل يقول: ولا تبغي الفساد في الأرض إن الله لا يحب المفسدين. فهذا الفساد يعني مسمى بالcorruption، speaking Indonesian corruption، إصلاح versus أو في مقابل الإفساد. إذا كانت علوم الدنيا الطب والهندسة والفلسفة وغير ذلك من علوم الدنيا يقصد بها خدمة الناس وإصلاح المعاش كما يذكر ابن خلدون وغيره، فهي كعلوم الآخرة، لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول: خيركم أنفعكم للناس. فتحقيق المنفعة للناس هو كذلك، وإن لم يكن عن طريق علوم الدنيا، إنما هو بخدمة الناس. خيركم سيد القوم خادمهم، أي خادمهم الذي ينفعهم ويسد رمقهم ويعينهم على قضاء حوائجهم الدنيوية، فذلك ييسر ويؤدي إلى خدمة المسلمين وخدمة البشرية. وخدمة الناس هي من أعلى مراتب التدين، وهذا يدعو إليه الإسلام. فليس هناك تقسيم في الإسلام بين ما هو ديني ودنيوي، إنما النظرة في الإسلام إلى الدنيا إنما تقسيمها إلى بعد ديني مادي أرضي وبعد سماوي روحي. فالتقسيم هنا مبني على ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة. المسلم يعمل هنا، وقل اعملوا فسيرى الله عملكم في الدنيا والآخرة، أي العمل في الدنيا سواء على أساس دنيوي ولكن بنية الخدمة سيرفيس، خدمة سيرفيس، وكذلك بنية الإصلاح، العدالة الذي يكون في القضاء يعني ويحقق العدل، فهو يخدم الدين وإن كان لم يكن خطيبا ولا عالما، إنما هو بتحقيق العدالة هو يخدم الدين والدنيا.
شكرا كثيرا على بيانكم الممتاز في خاصة في أمور التي تفرق بين العلمانية، وكيف هذه العلمانية تكون كذلك صحيحة في نظرة الإسلام ما دام هناك خدمة للآخر، خدمة للناس. السؤال الآخر يعني من السيد محمد نور، كما قلتم آنفا بأن قيام الإسلام له علاقة قوية بعلوم الدين وليس كما يرى العلمانيون. والسؤال: كيف نضع قيام الإسلام حتى يكون هذا القيام دورا أساسيا في علوم الدنيا؟ تفضل أستاذ.
لا شك أن للتربية والتعليم الدور الأساسي في بناء الأجيال. فمثلا، وأنا قلت هذا الكلام بالأمس حينما تحدثت الدكتورة أظن هينو عن الاحتباس الحراري global warming، وقالت كانت تقول أن الفتوى ليس عندها يعني معطيات وقرارات فيما يخص إندونيسيا، وفتوى MOE مجلس علماء إندونيسيا هل كان لها تأثير في تغيير المجتمع. وأنا قلت يجب على هذه الفتوى وغيرها من الإرشادات الدينية التي تصدر عن مجلس العلماء في إندونيسيا أو غيرهم، يجب أن تؤخذ بجد وتدرس في المدارس منذ الصغر للأطفال أن الإسلام يحرم الفساد في الأرض. والفساد في الأرض مثلا هو التلوث، بولوسي، والتلوث ورمي الزبالة مثلا في النهر وفي البحر. ظهر الفساد في البر والبحر بما كسبت أيدي الناس ليذيقهم بعض الذي عملوا لعلهم يرجعون. الله عز وجل يذكر أن الإفساد في الطبيعة، الاحتباس الحراري الذي عندنا ما يسمى بجلوبال وورمينج، هذا الجلوبال وورمينج والذي سبب في كلايمت تشينج، يعني تغير في الجو والحرارة. الآن نحن في أكتوبر وهناك حرارة شديدة، يعني غالبا هنا في اسطنبول مثلا، أنا هنا في اسطنبول عادة تكون الحرارة أقل من 10 درجات، لكنها الآن في 24، شيء غريب جدا. وكنت في المغرب عادة 15 درجة، الآن 30 درجة. هذا شيء غريب جدا. يعني climate change is a reality. global warming is a reality. هذا شيء، لكن هناك من ينكر ذلك. فندرس الأطفال في إندونيسيا حقيقة أن التلوث حقيقة، فكيف ندرس الأطفال في المدارس والجامعات الحفاظ على النظافة، يعني إزالة هذا من الإصلاح. الله يحب المصلحين ولا يحب الفساد في الأرض. فهذه الأشياء لها تأثير، هذه قيمة، هذه القيم values that should be taught at the level of elementary school, university, high school, to children and to students, that Islam is against pollution. Islam is contributing to the benefit of humanity and is teaching us the value of justice, the value of making up and recycling, and all these values are taught in Islam. So that's why these values should be taught. لذلك نؤكد أن الإسلام له دور، وللفتوى لأنها صدرت عن مجلس أعلى، مجلس العلماء في إندونيسيا، يجب أن تؤخذ بجد. هذا فقط مثال للإجابة عن السؤال.
إذن الأستاذ، هناك كذلك في الإسلام العلم يسمى بعلم حماية البيئة، هكذا؟
نعم.
The science of environment. هناك السيد أدريانوس خطيب، لكم السؤال للأستاذ حامد سليمي، فلتتفضل مشكورا. The committee, can you unmute Pak Adrianus Khotib? Ibu Umi, is it possible to unmute Adrianus? Okay. Umi? Okay.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ya.
Waalaikumsalam.
Yang Ustaz Hamid Slimi, ya. As'alukum syai'an sahlan wa qasira. Ya. Kaifa ra'yukum fima yata'allaq bitauhid bainal ulum al-ajamiyah atau bersama al-gharbiyah, ya. Nasiatan wa umum islamiyah nayatul ukhra wa bilisan bistilahi al-an al-ulum, ya, bitauhid umum atau isdiwal ma'arif. Hal yumkin amma yumkin bilan yatuq alati mu'addiya biha qadiman halan wa atiyan. Syukran jazilan. In about English, dear Mr. Hamid, according to my short question, is
Pak
it
Adrianus,
possible? Okay.
Pak Adrianus, الصوت غير واضح.
غير واضح. لماذا؟
Suara tidak bagus.
Tidak bagus. In English mungkin bagus ya. Dear Mr. Hamid Slady, according to you, is possible to integrate of knowledge of science and teaching in Islam. Professor Nakib Atas that integrated the both of them are impossible, but according the others are possible. Tell me please clearly. Thank you for your request and your thinking. Thank you. In English and in Arabic, not clear. I am very sorry. I am very sorry.
Thank you, Pak Adrianus Khotib. I think Professor Hamid Slimi was able to grasp the question that you offer. Please, Professor.
To be honest,
would you like to answer?
I could not hear. أنا لم أستطع السماع.
Adrianus,
ممكن كتابة؟ Manolise.
Would you mind writing your question in the chat?
I couldn't hear it.
Adrianus, please write your question in the chat. Okay. So in the meanwhile, in Indonesia, especially among Muslim students or santri, we memorize the definitions of Islam. When we were in the junior high school, we were taught that what is Islam? وَالدِّينُ الْحَقُّ الْخَالِدُ الْمُلَائِمُ فِي كُلِّ عَقْلٍ وَجِيلٍ وَزَمَانٍ وَمَكَانٍ. So it is a type of a dogmatic definition of Islam. Islam is the true, eternal, and appropriate religion in every mind, generation, age. And you are talking about the secularity, la laicite, or al-ilmaniya. And it is very interesting for us to have the connection between this ilmaniya, la laicite scholarization, and the disciplines or knowledge in Islam. And then you argue that as long as people believe in Allah and use these types of empirical knowledge or what or so-called al-ilmaniya for the benefits of other people, it is also a type of ulum dunya wal akhirah. So this is very interesting connections. Would you like to elaborate this connection, Professor Hamid Slimi, a little bit? Thank you.
I think I already spoke about this topic because the issue today is the Muslim student, the youth, see that religion is the source of our misery and backwardness. And because everything that comes from the West is better, everything that is European, everything that is American is better than anything that is Indonesian or Arabic or Turkish, whatever is Muslim country, there is this complexity or inferiority complex, unfortunately. And we as educators, as scholars, as professors, as imams, as teachers, our role is to give back the confidence to our youth that what we have and what we've had for over 1400 years has never been the source of our demise, but rather the fact that we lost those values and we did not take care of the concepts of justice, of solidarity, of humility, of seeking knowledge, as the Islamic teachings are. Seek knowledge. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Utlubu al-ilma walau fi as-Sin." Seek knowledge even if you have to go to China. And those values, we lost them, and we adopted other values that say, no, religion is the source of problem. That was not the case for Muslims. That was the case for people in Europe who were told that if you say that the earth is round, you have committed blasphemy. That if you say that people should be equal and there shouldn't be religious people given priority, or that the church should have, it should take your from your property. That was not the case of Islam. Islam came to empower us as individuals, to empower us as citizens, to empower us as people of a nation, not the opposite. So we are using, we are using, different contexts and applying them in our context. It was never the case for Muslims, but rather it was the case. Those books of Renaissance written in Europe, those philosophies of Descartes and Immanuel Kant and all this, we brought everything from Russia, from Europe, Marxism and all this, and we wanted them to apply them. We wanted to apply those things and those teachings in our societies to answer to a problem that occurred, and that was with the colonization. So everything, we were told that when you gain your freedom from colonization, the only way for civilization is to adopt what was adopted in Russia or in other places. So because of that, we are not the product of ourselves, but the product of others. And this is, to answer your question, we need to review, where did we miss it? Was it really Islam that caused our failure and demise, or something else? Why are we still behind? Because the colonizers, when they left society and a leadership that will always serve them. Take the example of Africa now. Africa, even 70, 80 years after the French and the British left, they are still using it. Africa is one of the richest continents on earth. Yet, it's the poorest because the people are not using their resources. They're still following, there's still companies they're told. Even you go to Indonesia, anywhere in the world, if it's a local organization or a business, it's bad. It has to be a certain country. We don't believe in each other. If you find the same jacket made in Indonesia, and you would go with the one made in Japan or made in Italy, same, and you will find the higher quality, Indonesian quality, nice shirt, and still people will not buy the Indonesian because it's Indonesian, it's local. They would rather buy a polyester, artificial kind of thread made shirt and jacket and buy it because it says made in France or made in Italy. That mentality has to change. We can keep talking, but the idea is, when you look at yourself as being lower and that you always have to depend on somebody else, and that somebody else actually reached what he reached because of your values, the values of science. This is the dilemma we have today. when we speak about civilization, it's not just about adopting. Civilization is about inventing and creating. We can look today in Asia, Japan, China, and they're reviewing. They say, you know what? We need to become independent. We need to become the ones who invent. And the same thing can be in Muslim countries, in spite of the fact that we're divided. It has to do with the Muslim mind. Yes, رَبَّنَا آتِنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ حَسَنَةً. Give us good in dunya and akhirah. It's not only akhirah, dunya and akhirah. This balance is extremely important.
Very interesting to hear from you, Professor Hamid, the concept that scholarization is all about inventing and innovation. I think that Muslims should also proceed. And we have question from Pa Adrianus Khotib, which was not clear, and he wrote it in the chat. Let me read it. كيف رأيكم يا الأستاذ فيما يتعلق بتوحيد العلوم الأجنبية الغربية ناحية والعلوم الإسلامية ناحية أخرى وبالاصطلاح الآخر ازدواج المعارف هل يمكن أو لا يمكن لنؤدي بهما في وقت واحد دلنا الطرق التي أن نتبع في الازدواج بينهما شكرا.
ازدواجية المعرفة أو ما يقال أو ما يسمى بالحداثة أو ما يسمى كذلك بأسلمة المعارف. يعني أسلمت المعارف الأخذ بالعلوم الدنيوية أو علوم، حينما نقول دنيوية العلوم العلمية أو الأدبية وغيرها، ووضع الطابع الإسلامي عليها. هذه أشياء منهجية في الحقيقة. الأساس هو المنطلق من أين تنطلق. أنا يعجبني نموذج أوين. ندرس الإسلام وندرس علوما أخرى من خلال interdisciplinary studies. يعني هناك التخصص، أهل التخصص في الإسلام ليتخصصوا في الشريعة وفي القانون، وليتخصصوا في العقيدة وأصول الدين، وليتخصصوا في علوم أخرى. لكن نريد أناس متخصصين في الاقتصاد الإسلامي. هؤلاء ما يسمى بinterdisciplinary، يدرسون الاقتصاد ويدرسون مفاهيم اقتصادية إسلامية مبنية على أسس ومبادئ إسلامية. إذن هؤلاء نحتاجهم. كذلك القانون، هناك قانون وضعي لكن هناك شريعة، والشريعة تحتاج إلى تطور بعض المفاهيم. المجتمع تغير، فلا بد من تحديث بعض المفاهيم. المبادئ هي مبادئ الشريعة لا تتغير والإسلام لا يتغير، لكن الأمثلة والسياق يتغير. فهذا ما يسمى بالتجديد والاجتهاد. وليس هناك ازدواجية في الحقيقة، إنما هو مواكبة العصر واستجابة لحوائج الناس وحاجياتهم. فالإسلام صالح لكل زمان ومكان، ولكن لا بد من إعمال المقاصد، مقاصد الشريعة، وإعمال القواعد الإسلامية legal maxims and objectives of the Islamic law, and using those essences in understanding the reality. يعني باللغة العربية ربط الوحي بالواقع relating revelation to reality. الله يقول وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط. ونحن الآن في ستوك ماركت فيما يسمى بسوق الأسهم. كيف نحقق القسط والعدل في الاقتصاد؟ الله يأمرنا بالقسط، فإذا كان حتى قانون وضعي بشري يضمن القسط والعدل فهذا من الإسلام. الإمام الشاطبي يقول حيثما وجد العدل فثم شرع الله. Wherever you find justice, that is the divine law. So يعني العبرة بالمعاني وليست بالمباني. It's what you achieve according to Islamic teachings, not necessarily has to be called an Islamic term. In America, for instance, there are many laws that protect the dignity of people, protect the human beings, protect, in Canada we have the Charter of Freedom and Rights. يعني إعلان مثل بانشاسيلا في إندونيسيا، إعلان حقوق المواطنين وحرياتهم، حرية التدين وحرية التجول وغير ذلك. صحيفة المدينة التي أعلنها النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، مدينة Constitution، هي أعلنت حرية التنقل وحرية التجارة وحرية التبادل وحرية التدين، وفيها بنود كثيرة أكثر من 70 بندا تضمن الحقوق للمواطنين. قد إذا أخذتها من السياق الإسلامي وضعتها في السياق غير الإسلام ينظر إليها على أساس أنها يعني إعلان لحقوق الإنسان وحقوق المواطنين. في زمن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان أول مشرع يعلن هذا الإعلان، حتى حمورابي قبله لم يعلن مثل هذا، قوانين حمورابي أو في القوانين غيرها. فلذلك إذا نظرنا ليس هناك ازدواجية، وإنما هي مواكبة وتجديد واجتهاد. النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إن الله يبعث لهذه الأمة من يجدد أمر دينها، فهذا التجديد. لذلك ضرورة الاجتهاد والتجديد هي الطريق الوحيد للجواب على الأخ الذي سأل السؤال. التجديد والاجتهاد هو الطريق الوحيد لضمان هذه الأشياء. وأخيرا الاجتهاد يكون جماعيا في زماننا هذا، لأن ليس عندنا أناس قد يعني يجتهدون فرادى، فهذا أمر صعب. لكن الاجتهاد من خلال المجامع الفقهية والمجامع الإسلامية اجتهاد جماعي.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Hamid Slimi, for your excellent explanations and lectures. And I would like you to give final remarks about how Muslims generation today study or understand Islam after the 9/11. Yeah. بعد 11 من سبتمبر. دقيقة واحدة تفضل.
المسلمون يدرسون الإسلام بطريقة انتقائية. معنى ذلك أنها طريقة ليست بجملة. يعني كنا ندرس الإسلام وندرس الإسلام بطريقة عامة. الآن عندنا تركيز أكثر لأن الأسئلة أكثر عن الإسلام والأسئلة متخصصة. يعني السؤال يكون مركزا على مسألة في الإسلام، يجب الجواب يكون مركز. Before we used to teach and learn Islam in a general way, wholesale، جملة. الآن ندرس، we are teaching Islam and learning with specific goals in a very focused way. That's a lesson after 9/11. When we spoke about Islam, we spoke Islamic solution. This, not anymore. Islam, we speak about economy, medicine, civilization, in many ways. Because in the Western world, they specialize in things. We Muslims were very general. We need more focus. The way we write, the way we speak, the way it has to be very focused. That's the lesson in 1 minute. There are many other things, but this is one of the major lessons.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Hamid Salimi, for your excellent lecture. And we are highly enlightened by your thoughtful ideas in regard especially al-Qanun al-Wad'i, constitution, and how Muslim today should understand Islam in this 21st century. And Barakallahu fikum, and we hope that we will meet you again. Najtami fi yawmin wa fi hinin akhar insyaallah, wa ma taufiqi illa billah, alaihi tawakkaltu wa ilahi unibu. And this is the time for break. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Terima kasih. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.
Thank you.
Juga terima kasih Bapak Ibu semuanya dan panitia. Thank you very much.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Right.
Bagi panitia, harap cantumkan nama depannya SC, SH.
Ya udah itu SH.
Iya,
Mas
kalau ada yang
Fadlan,
belum,
buruan.
kalau ada yang belum. Sudah saya berikan co-host. Ada lagi? Oke. Ada lagi yang belum? SH harus diganti.